time in a little bit, and basically today's video is going to be my predictions of how I think the 2022 Hall of Fame class is going to go for the NFL. I wanted to do this for baseball, but I completely ran out of time. Next thing I know, they're announcing it. And yeah, so of course I know a little bit more about football than I do baseball to an extent. So this is going to be fun. I'm going to kind of do who I would vote for. And there are some big names here on the ballot, and we're only going to focus on the 15 modern era finalists for players. We're not going to worry about the coaches or senior membership players like that, senior candidate, contributor. We're just going to focus on the players. So we definitely have an interesting class, potential class to have. It's defensive heavy. So we have 3 wide receivers in Torry Holt, Reggie Wayne, and first-time finalist Andre Johnson. We have 2 offensive tackles in Tony Boselli and first-time finalist Willie Anderson. You know, hey, it works out for the Bengals. They finally get a candidate here, and the potential for the Hall of Fame for the first time in like 13 years. So credit to them. And then the rest are defense/specialists. So we'll go with the first specialist here. Kick returner, punt returner, Devin Hester. And then on the defense, we have a defensive end in Jared Allen, a pair of D tackles in Richard Seymour and Bryant Young. Young making his first appearance on the ballot. I should have mentioned that for Hester too. This is his first appearance on the ballot. And then we got 4 linebackers. Sam Mills and Zach Thomas are the first 2. And then DeMarcus Ware and Patrick Willis, both making their first appearances on the top part of the ballot, the final 15. And then for defensive backs, we got corner Ronde Barber and safety LeRoy Butler. So we're in a good position here where I'm just looking forward to this whole situation. I've done some research, so I'm definitely excited to see how everything turns out. But please, again, these are somewhat my predictions and what I think they're going to do. If you think differently, please feel free to look back and say, oh, hey, you were dead wrong with that. Or, hey, you went 5 for 5. I'm proud of you. So just remember, this is my predictions as of the morning of February 2nd, 2022. So hopefully everything gets released on the 10th like they're planning. Speaking of, just got to quickly plug myself here. So next week we are doing our NFL Hall of Fame week. We're going to have 6 videos coming up. We're going to have 3 trade breakdowns, 2 player bios, and then I'm going to have a video where we discuss. I'm shooting for Friday for that video just because I don't know when they're going to release it on Thursday. But if they release all the news like Thursday morning and I have a chance, or Wednesday night and I have a chance to do it, I'll do it Thursday morning. But it's going to be tough. To me, it's just going to be tough to do Thursday. So I'm expecting Friday. I'm expecting it to be Friday. Anyways, on to the actual candidates and everything like that. So I'm just going to kind of go and break them down, break each player down, and then we'll give you who I think my 5 players would be that make the Hall of Fame. Now, of course, that was an interesting glitch, but so, of course, these are going to be my predictions, and yeah. So, first things first, Reggie Wayne. So Reggie Wayne, of course, was one of the most dominant receivers in the 2000s at minimum, the early 2000s. He had a longer career. He spent 15 years in the NFL, and he's, of course, mostly known for being a Colt. He spent his entire official career as a member of the Indianapolis Colts. He spent an offseason in New England, but nothing came of that. He didn't even make the team. So, yeah, but Wayne, I mean, he was just an extremely talented player. He grew into himself. He didn't have a great start to his career, but by like 2003, 2004, he just started to pick up. And 2004 was his first 1,000-yard season. He would have a whopping 8 1,000-yard seasons over the next 9 years. The only one he didn't have one was 2011, when, of course, Indianapolis didn't really have a quarterback that year. That was the year where Peyton Manning was hurt and Andrew Luck stepped in the next year, so you had no one there in 2011. But he didn't really have a horrible year. He still had just under 1,000 yards at 960. So, he's a talented receiver in his own likes. He was a very good receiver in Indianapolis, and I mean, the accolades speak for themselves too. He, of course, did win a Super Bowl. He was a 6-time Pro Bowler, 1-time first-team All-Pro, 2-time second-team All-Pro, and he led the league in receiving yards once. Now, there's a couple problems here for Reggie Wayne. First things first, he's only a 1-time first-team All-Pro, 2-time second-team All-Pro. So, 3 All-Pro selections. I get it, receiver is a very tough position to stand out, but only having 3 is a little bit of a concern. Secondly, he is a member of the Indianapolis Colts. We've seen a lot of Colts make it into the Hall of Fame in recent years. Of course, we've got Peyton Manning. So, it's going to be a tough battle for him to make it. They just don't want to continuously put, offensive players from the same team in all these years in a row. I'm not going to say it wouldn't be fair, but they want to get more versatility out there. They want to get more variety out there. So, next we have Torry Holt. And Holt is in a very similar position as Reggie Wayne, actually. So, Holt actually had a strong career as well. He was drafted in '99 by St. Louis, and he would spend the majority of his career. He spent 10 years with the Rams, and then he spent the last year of his career with the Jaguars. But he didn't put up the elite stats that Wayne did over a long time. Still, though, he did have 8 1,000-yard seasons, I should say. And that was from 2000 through 2007. So every year there, he had 1,000-plus yards receiving. Actually, the lowest he had there was 1,188. So, he was a part of the greatest show on turf. Technically, he was. He didn't have an amazing rookie year, but other than that, I mean, he was just a very strong player. Torry Holt's the type of guy who he's a good player. He was a very good player. Now, one thing that always kind of stood out, I remember when he requested his release from the Rams, it was kind of surprising, but at the same time, the Rams were not going in the right direction. They didn't really need him. The Jaguars, but he did end up going to the Patriots as well at one point, but he never played for them. He got hurt. Similar story with Reggie Wayne. So his accolades, he, of course, like Wayne, did win a Super Bowl. He was a 1-time first-team All-Pro, 1-time second-team All-Pro. He made 7 Pro Bowls. He was a 2-time receiving yards leader in the NFL. So he led the league in receptions once, and he's a member of the NFL 2000s All-Decade Team. So comparing him to Reggie Wayne, you do have similar statistics to an extent, within a single season. Like in individual seasons, if you were to average, Holt does beat Wayne, but the longevity of Wayne's career gives him better stats. And Holt also has more Pro Bowl selections. Wayne does have more All-Pro selections. So it's kind of a tough battle between the two of them. The knock on Torry Holt, so it's getting to be less and less of what it was a few years back. But Holt, just like Reggie Wayne is facing, a lot of his teammates from the greatest show on turf are starting to, they recently have gotten inducted in the Hall of Fame. So now that it's kind of coming to an end, of course, like Orlando Pace recently, I think he was the most recent one to make the Hall of Fame. So with these guys finally making the Hall of Fame, it does help Torry Holt in his case to make it. But another knock for him, he didn't spend a lot of time playing in the NFL and only 2 All-Pro selections. So the last receiver we have on the list here is Andre Johnson. Johnson, first ballot, has a chance to become a first ballot Hall of Famer in a class that, it's definitely possible for him to do it. Now, of course, Andre Johnson, he broke out. He was a draft pick in '03 for Houston, and he spent a long portion of his career as a Texan. He spent 12 years in Houston, and then he hopped around another 2 AFC South teams for his next 2, Indy and Tennessee. Now, he never was like an elite, consistent threat, but he was one of the best receivers in football with some teams that did not have good quarterback play, did not have good offensive line play. So you look at his numbers, and it's like, oh, wow, he may not have had the multiple 1,000-yard seasons in a row like Torry Holt did, but he was still a very strong player. You look at him, he did have 7 1,000-plus yard seasons, and I mentioned it for Holt, so I'll mention it for him. The lowest in that group was an 1,142, and that was his second year in the league. But the big thing for him, like I said before, he just didn't have good line play. He didn't have good quarterback play. So you do have to give him a little bit of a break on the stats. He still played very well. It was always a nightmare going up against Andre Johnson. Like, if you went up against the Texans, you were afraid of Andre Johnson. Simple as that. He was an absolute beast. I mean, we'll get to this in a second, but he did have a career 14,185 yards. He had 70 touchdowns. He's right up there in all-time leaders of receiving yards. So his accolades are there too. He's a 3-time first-team All-Pro pick, 2-time second-team All-Pro, 7-time Pro Bowler. He led the league in receptions twice and receiving yards twice. So, yeah. Now, the downside for him, the Hall is usually a little skeptical about making first ballot Hall of Famers a thing. But, I mean, if that's really the only downside I have on you, you got a good chance. I mean, the other guys who are here, the other receivers, Andre's got the better stats than both of them, so I'm just going to put that out there. Next, we have Tony Boselli. So Tony Boselli is a very tough one to peg. He was a very good offensive tackle. Of course, he was the 2nd overall pick in the 95 draft by Jacksonville, and he was just an absolute amazing specimen to watch on the football field when he was healthy from 95 until 2001 when he was a Jaguar. Problem is, health just completely ruined his career. So, it got awful. As good as he was, he ends up getting picked in the 02 expansion draft by Houston, but he spends the entire year on the injured reserve, and then he ends up retiring. It just became awful for him. He was so good, but not for long enough. That was the thing. He wasn't good for long enough. That's like the big problem with Tony Boselli that people will point out. He only was in the league for, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 2000, 2001. So 7 years he officially played. He counts for 8. So as good as he was he good enough? He was a 5-time Pro Bowler, 3-time first-team All-Pro. He was a member of the NFL 1990s All-Decade team. So you got to look at that. And he was also named the Alumni Offensive Lineman of the Year in 1998. So he was getting a lot of respect back then. The big knock for him, like I said, is just how much time he spent in the league. He's continuously been making it to the finals here, and it just continues to become a debate of did he play for long enough? Did he play for long enough to make the Hall? Next, we have the other offensive tackle on the ballot here, Willie Anderson. So Anderson, he's one of the older players, I guess you could say, on the ballot. He finally made it. He's finally there. He's been waiting to get the call to the top 15. Like I said before, he's a very good, he was a very good player. He was drafted in 96 by Cincinnati, and Bengals, spent the final year of his career with the Ravens. And there's not really a lot of stats to talk about for offensive tackles, but he was a 4-time Pro Bowler, 3-time first-team All-Pro selection, a 1-time second-team All-Pro selection. So he was definitely there. He had he was a very good tackle. It was always kind of a nightmare to go up against him. But the knock on him is he had a dominant stretch of like 4 or 5 years. Other than that, he was good, but not like elite Hall of Fame status. So that's the big knock on him. Next, we're going to go with, like I said, I'm going to go with Devin Hester here. Hester is definitely the most polarizing player on the ballot here. It's kind of like you're going to have the purists. It's similar to baseball to an extent with the whole steroid era guys, because you're going to have people saying, why are you going to vote in a guy who just did special teams? It doesn't make sense. Now, technically speaking, Hester was like drafted to be a corner, and then he would become a receiver, but I mean, he didn't do anything with catching passes or, intercepting. He didn't do that stuff. He was a kick returner. He was a punt returner. Easy as that. He holds multiple NFL records. He was like the big reason why Chicago was able to make the Super Bowl in 06. But, I mean, you look at like his stats, he had a combined total of 255 receptions throughout his career, and his career spanned at 11 years. So that should tell you right there, he's not a receiver. You look at his kick returns, he had, So for kickoffs, 295 returns for 7,333 yards. He had 5 touchdowns. For punt returns, 315 for 3,695 and 14 touchdowns. So he was there. He was dominant. He was just an amazing player. He did also return a missed field goal for a touchdown in an 06 game. So he just had the speed. You couldn't catch him. He has multiple NFL records. Just to name a few of them, most non-offensive touchdowns in a career. So in other words, special teams touchdowns. Most punt returns in a career. Punt return touchdowns in a career. And a season at 14 and 4 respectively. Most kickoff and punt return touchdowns in a career at 19. Just most combined return yards in a season. Or touchdowns in a season, sorry. Fastest touchdown in Super Bowl history as he scored a opening kickoff touchdown for Chicago, 14 seconds. So he's there. He has multiple Chicago Bears records. We're not going to get into that. I mean, he's just an extremely talented player. It was always horrible going up against him because you knew he was one split second away from getting a touchdown. Every single play. Every single time he kicked the ball off, you were afraid. You wanted to go away from him. And those stats that we read off are with players or with punters and coaches planning on avoiding Devin Hester. You have to keep that in mind. They didn't want to kick to him. They would go to the other return man. They would intentionally kick it out of bounds. They did not want to kick to him. He was a 3-time first-team All-Pro selection, 1-time second-team All-Pro selection, 4-time Pro Bowler, and he was named the Special Teams Player of the Year 3 separate times. He's a member of the NFL 2000s and 2010s All-Decade teams. And, of course, he is a member of the NFL 100th Anniversary All-Time Team. He is also considered one of the 100 greatest Bears of all time, which, of course, is expected. Now, the knock on him, like I said, special teams player, not a offensive player, not a defensive player. And we know how skeptical the Hall is on voting those guys in, special teams players. Next, we have Jared Allen. Now, I'll admit, Allen was one of my absolute favorite players when I was a kid. I loved watching him play. He was arguably my favorite non-Eagle. So, I was so happy when I heard he made the Final 15 here. And he's a very good player. He started off his career, of course, in Kansas City. And then he ends up getting traded to Minnesota because Kansas City didn't need an expensive D lineman. And he spent a good 6 years as a Viking, terrorizing opposing players before ending his career with a year and a half in Chicago and a half year in Carolina. But no one's going to talk about those last couple years. All said and done, he recorded an impressive number of sacks at 136. He had 32 forced fumbles. So he was a force. He was constantly getting to the quarterback. I mean, he was just an amazing player. He had 4 safeties in his career, and of course we all know the most famous one came against the 2008 Detroit Lions, where he chased Dan Orlovsky out of bounds in the end zone. That's by far the most famous safety in his career. So that he does have that NFL record. He led the league in sacks twice, which is also tied for an NFL record, but you do have to take into consideration sacks weren't an official stat until 1982. So, there's that. Still, though, he was a 4-time first-team All-Pro, 5-time Pro Bowler, and he led the league in sacks, like I said, twice. He's also considered one of the 50 greatest Vikings ever. The knock on him, there's so much defensive line talent in the league's history, and, does he belong in that elite class? Yes or no? And then the other knock on him would just be, did he play at a dominant level for long enough? Next, we're going to have Richard Seymour. And Seymour is kind of a tough one to look at, or talk about, I should say. So, Seymour spent the majority of his career, he spent 8 years in New England, and then the last 4 in Oakland. So, he was good, but was he good enough? He was a part of the beginning of the Patriots dynasty, the first dynasty for the Patriots. He got 3 rings with them. And that was before he really broke out. But if we're looking at sacks, you do have to remember, Jared Allen was a D end, Richard Seymour was mostly a D tackle. So he had 57.5 sacks over his 12-year career, which admittedly isn't that impressive, but again, he's a defensive tackle. They can easily double team you if you're a D tackle that's getting sacks. So the stats aren't going to really help him out all that much. What is notable is he had 35 passes defended, so that's pretty cool. Like I said, he was a 3-time Super Bowl champ, 7-time Pro Bowler, 3-time first-team All-Pro selection, 2-time second-team All-Pro selection. He's a member of a ton of Patriots groups here, and he was a member of the NFL 2000s All-Decade team. The knock on him, did he play long enough at a dominant level to actually make the Hall of Fame? That's one of my big knocks on him. Next, we have Bryant Young. Now, Bryant Young, he technically was mostly a D tackle, but he also he could also be considered a D end at times. He did play D end. He spent his entire career from 94 to 07 as a San Francisco 49er. You don't see a lot of that. And just because a lot of guys who played out on the West Coast around that time, I didn't do a lot of film study on because I was 10 years old when he retired. So unless you were in the NFC East, I probably didn't know much about you, or in the AFC East for that matter. So I had to do a lot of research once I saw he was a finalist. But he was still a pretty successful player. So throughout his career, he did combine to get 89.5 sacks. So he's up there in the sack list. He had 29 passes defended. So again, I like bringing that stat up for D tackles because it shows that they're constantly getting at the quarterback. They're throwing their arms up when they have to. He was a Super Bowl champion, so that helps him out. He was a comeback player of the year one time. He was a one-time first-team All-Pro selection, 3-time second-team All-Pro selection, and a 4-time Pro Bowler. He was also a member of the NFL 1990s All-Decade team. He also did serve as the Atlanta Falcons defensive line coach for 3 years, 2016 to 2019. Knock on him, as good as he was, as dominant as he was for a time, he wasn't that good for long enough. That's the knock on him. So now we're in the linebackers, and we're going to start off with Sam Mills here. So Sam Mills, he was a very good player for some time, but he wasn't like an amazing player. So that should be noted. First things first. But when he played, he was extremely good. So he just constantly was all over the place. But the thing with him is he kind of bounced around the league before officially like getting a job with the Saints in 86. So in 81, he failed to make the Browns. Then he went to the CFL, didn't do anything in the CFL, went to the USFL for 3 years for the Philadelphia Baltimore Stars, and he was great in the USFL. Then finally, the Saints gave him a shot in 86, and he kind of held on to the NFL job for 12 years, spending most of his time with the Saints, the last 3 years with Carolina, and he became like attached to Carolina. So when you talk about Sam Mills, you're usually talking about Carolina just because he fell in love with the place. The fans fell in love with him. He made his first Pro Bowl in 87, and he was old when he made it too. That's the other thing. Like, he was just one of the bigger, older players, I guess you could say. So he was a good player, all things considered. I mean, he had only 20 sacks in his career, but he had 1,300 tackles. He had 11 picks, 4 touchdowns. He was a 1-time first-team All-Pro, 2-time second-team All-Pro selection, 5-time Pro Bowler. So the accolades and the stats are good, but not great. As much as I hate to say it, I can't see him making it. He's unfortunately passed away 16, 17 years ago at this point. It's been a while. But as it goes, it's just his last year of potential eligibility on the modern era ballot. So it just kind of seems like a nod to say, hey, we appreciate what you've done, but I just don't see it. Next, we have Zach Thomas. Now, Zach Thomas, admittedly, my dad being a Dolphins fan, I kind of always watched Zach Thomas play when I was a kid, so I was extremely excited to see him. Just like Mills, he had 20.5 sacks in his career, but he had more tackles at 1,700. But he also played in more games. He did have the same amount of touchdowns at 4. He forced a solid 17 fumbles. He also recorded 17 picks. But he was in the league for a while. he spent the first 12 years of his career as a Dolphin, went to the Cowboys for a year, and then went to Kansas City, but didn't play for Kansas City. So, for a 5th-round pick, I mean, great value for Miami, for sure. He was a 5-time first-team All-Pro, 2-time second-team All-Pro selection, 7-time Pro Bowler, and he was a 2-time pick for the NFL Alumni Linebacker of the Year. And it wasn't just like back-to-back years. It was 98 and 06. So he was just a dominant player time and time again. He's, of course, a member of the NFL 2000s All-Decade team. The knock on him, it's kind of hard to find a knock on him. I mean, you could say he didn't win a Super Bowl, but so what? I mean, Dan Marino didn't win a Super Bowl. Any player, Calvin Johnson didn't win a Super Bowl. So, yeah. Then we'll go to DeMarcus Ware, and that should end this game. So I'll be finding a new game after this one. But so DeMarcus Ware started off his career in Dallas. He was a first-round pick in 2005, and he kind of stepped up. He was a very strong player there for 9 years. He was a force. I just consistently remember watching DeMarcus Ware play against the Eagles. He was constantly in the backfield, constantly causing havoc. You kind of thought he was an edge rusher mostly. He was kind of like a Lawrence Taylor type of player where he would blitz a lot, but he could still cover if he had to. He spent 3 years in Denver, and that's where he did win a Super Bowl. So his Super Bowl win was definitely an important one. He needed it, and it really just bolstered his stat line. A lot of people were excited when he officially won the Super Bowl. He was a 4-time first-team All-Pro selection, 3-time second-team All-Pro selection. So there's that. He was also a 9-time Pro Bowler. He led the league in sacks twice. So he was also a member of the NFL 2000s All-Decade team. So in other words, I mean, he was just a super strong player. And he was all over the place. He didn't have the tackle numbers that the other linebackers had. But again, he was mostly getting at the quarterback. He had 138.5 sacks in his career. He had 35 forced fumbles in his career. For a guy who's blitzing most of the time, very impressive numbers. The knock on him, it just like Taylor, it's tough. I mean, the knock on him is I don't know if the voters are going to feel comfortable putting in 2 linebackers in the same class. So that's my big knock. But hey, we have one more linebacker to look at, and that is Patrick Willis. Patrick Willis spent his entire career from 2007 to 2014 as a San Francisco 49er. And he was just an amazing superstar player. In his 8 years in the league, he was a 5-time first-team All-Pro, 1-time second-team All-Pro. So that right there should tell you something. He was a first-time All-Pro more often than he wasn't in the NFL. But just like Tony Boselli, the career length is a bit of a concern. He was also a 7-time Pro Bowler, and he led the league in tackles twice. He was a member of the NFL 2010s All-Decade team, despite only playing up until 2014. That's how good he was. He had 950 tackles and 20 sacks, along with 8 interceptions and 16 forced fumbles in his career. He was a super talented player. I mean, his first year in the league, he led the league in solo tackles with 135 and combined tackles at 174. He was just that good. It was a nightmare going up against Patrick Willis. You didn't know what was going to happen. Now, he was dealing with a toe injury in 2014, and this is what ended his career. He's like, all right, you know what? I don't need to deal with this anymore. And it was a surprise when it happened. I still remember when it happened. But for the one-time Rookie of the Year winner, I mean, he was such a good player. Like I said, as good as he was, the big knock on him is just, simply put, did he play long enough to make the Hall of Fame? So now we're in the secondary, and we have Ronde Barber, who, you guys know I'm an Eagles fan. I remember Ronde Barber in the 0-2 championship game. That's all I really can say about that, Ronde Barber. But, you know, he was an extremely good player. He spent his entire 15-year career as a Buccaneer. Before it was cool to be in Tampa Bay, he was one of the big pieces of their defense that, of course, went on to win the Super Bowl 0-2 over the Raiders. Of course, it was him, Derek Brooks, and Warren Sapp were the big 3 on that defense. There were other amazing players too, but those are the big 3. He was, of course, a 1-time Super Bowl champ. He was a 3-time first-team All-Pro, 2-time second-team All-Pro, 5-time Pro Bowler. He led the league in interceptions once, or he's tied. His all-decade team for the NFL. Now, his career stats were pretty impressive, especially considering that he didn't play much at all as a rookie. I mean, he combined to have 1,200 tackles, so he was there. He had 28 sacks as a secondary member. That's decent. He had a strong 166 passes defended, and that stat wasn't recorded until 2001. So the first 4 years, we'll say 3 years of his career, were just kind of ignored because we're not going to really look at his rookie year. He didn't do anything as a rookie. He only appeared in a couple games. I mean, he was just a strong player. He's actually, he was a 3rd-round pick. That's why he didn't play all that much. Of course, one thing I always remember was that his twin brother Tiki Barber was also a dominant player in the NFL for a little bit, not as long. That was always the problem with Tiki Barber, but he also has attitude. But anyway, Ronde Barber was such a strong player. He had 14 defensive touchdowns in his career. When he retired, he was the leader at that. So it's just worth noting. Ronde Barber definitely has a shot. Last player we have here is LeRoy Butler. Now, Butler, again, he's one of the guys who I don't necessarily remember watching all that much because he retired in 01. He spent his entire 12-year career from 1990 to 01 as a Packer. For a 2nd-round pick, that's impressive. He did win a Super Bowl one time. He was a 4-time first-team All-Pro pick. He was a 4-time Pro Bowler, and he was a member of the 1990s All-Decade team. He had career totals of just under 900 tackles, 38 interceptions, 20.5 sacks, and 13 forced fumbles. So he was a great player, but there's a reason he's been held off making the Hall of Fame for this long. And it's just kind of tough when you look back at it. It's kind of like, all right, what did he do? Now, Butler, I do want to say, one of the most notable things for him is he literally is credited with inventing the whole Lambeau leap thing. When you score a touchdown in Lambeau, you jump into the stands. He's credited for doing it. It's worth noting. So I think it's pretty cool that this is the guy who did that, and he could arguably be in the Hall of Fame for that alone. But I mean, we'll see. We'll see. So this is the 2nd time he's a finalist, which is worth noting. He's been, retired for so long at this point. But yeah. So if I had to pick who I think will be the guys who make the Hall of Fame, I mean, first things first. As much as I hate to say it, Sam Mills, you're not making the Hall of Fame. To me, Sam Mills is just the type of guy who was like, all right, it's his last year. He might get in as a veteran guy in the future, but he's not getting in 2022. It's not going to happen. I hate to say it, but it's just not going to happen. He was good, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. So, I also don't think Willie Anderson will make it. I mean, he still has time. He was a dominant player too, but he just gets easily outshined by Tony Boselli. And we know how skeptical the Hall is with, getting guys who are the same position into the Hall of Fame. Speaking of positions, Torry Holt, Reggie Wayne, and Andre Johnson, of the 3 of them, I mean, it's tough, but I got to eliminate Torry Holt from the 3. He's just the one who didn't play long enough. I'm also going to have to eliminate Reggie Wayne just because he doesn't have the stats, all things considered. And that kind of tells you one of my picks for the Hall of Fame. But as much as I like Torry Holt, and I think he should have been a Hall of Famer a couple years back, he's going to have to wait at least one more year, unfortunately for him. Reggie Wayne, I think he'll be in the Hall of Fame in the future, but you're probably waiting another couple years with him as well. Just because the exact reason why Torry Holt had to wait for so long with all this garbage of we don't want to have 3 players from the same group on the same team make the Hall of Fame within 4 years. We want diversity spread out for positions and teams. I get it, but I don't at the same time. I get it, but I don't. So next, I mean, as good as I like, as much as I like players like Bryant Young, I don't see him making the Hall of Fame this year. He's got a chance to make it in the future. I just don't see it now. LeRoy Butler, same thing. I think he's going to be waiting another year at least. He was a good player, but I just don't see him making it today in 2022. Richard Seymour, strong, very talented defensive player. And, I mean, honestly, the early 2000s Patriots are getting slept on to an extent. I mean, Vinatieri will get in first ballot. Brady will get in first ballot in 2027 now. But it's still kind of tough to find Patriots that made the Hall of Fame around that time. Seymour should make it in the future. I just don't see it right now. So that means I'm down to 8 guys for my class of 5. And it's getting kind of tough at this point. I have 1 receiver left. I have 1 offensive tackle left. I have the specialist back left. I have 1 D lineman. I have 3 linebackers, and I have 1 secondary member left. So the easy choice here is to get rid of one of the linebackers, and this is where it gets really tough. But I mean, it's just kind of brutal here with who I'd eliminate. And of them, the next one I will be eliminating is... It gets tough. It's really tough. I'm really trying to figure it out. Yeah, I'm going to have to say Patrick Willis. As dominant as he was, as absolutely amazing as he was, and I think he's a real X factor. I think he definitely has a chance to make the Hall of Fame this year. I think he has a very good chance to make the Hall of Fame this year. And I'm willing to bet that he will be in the Hall of Fame within the next handful of years. My big problem with Willis is he did not play long enough. And like I said, he will make it at some point, but the other 2 guys in front of him, Thomas and Ware, both have better accolades than he does, so they're both going to get the nod over Willis as far as I'm concerned. Willis will make it in the future. Speaking of, Jared Allen, I mentioned him before, absolutely love him. I think he'll get in the Hall of Fame. It just won't be in 2022. I could see him sneaking in, but I think I probably should have eliminated him before Willis. I think the 2 of them will eventually be in the Hall together, but it's not going to happen today. So now I'm down to my final 6, and this is where it really starts to get fun, because I absolutely love a couple of these guys. And, I mean, of them, it's really getting tough to who I'd eliminate next. But, I mean, I have somewhat equal representation. I'm going to say that I think Ronde Barber is going to be the one who has to wait 1 more year. So that would mean that my class of Hall of Famers for 2022 is going to be headlined by some intriguing names. Very intriguing names. Of course, first ballot, Andre Johnson would be my receiver. He has better stats than both Torry Holt and Reggie Wayne, so he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. He did it with some very, very iffy players at quarterback and on the O-line, so the quarterback was constantly under pressure. So, very strong player, very productive receiver, was always a threat. You always hated going up against him, whether it was in fantasy or in real life. I am finally giving the nod to another AFC South player in Tony Boselli. He's constantly been waiting to make the Hall of Fame. It's been such a long time for him. The shortness of his career is definitely what's been holding him back. As great as he was as a Jaguar, Boselli belongs in the Hall of Fame. He's constantly been named a finalist to make the Hall of Fame. I think this is the year he'll finally make it. At this point, I'm seeing a lot of talk. All these fans, all the media, we're kind of all rallying behind Tony Boselli. We're kind of like, all right, we need Boselli in the Hall of Fame. Boselli belongs in the Hall of Fame. And if you got, public opinion isn't what's going to make you a Hall of Famer. I get that. But Tony Boselli, everyone's rallied behind him. I think at this point, when they had their conference call last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, they had to say, all right, Boselli's in. We put in Calvin Johnson last year. I think it's time to put in Tony Boselli this year. Now, the most polarizing player I'm putting in the Hall of Fame is Devin Hester. But as a person who grew up in the 2000s watching football, all the time in the mid to late 2000s, 2010s, Devin Hester belongs in the Hall of Fame. He was a game changer, and that's what the whole thing with Hall of Fame players are. Game changers. I am not picking a guy to be in the Hall of Fame because he was good. I want a game changer. I would rather have the most electric punt returner of all time make it than a guy who was a very good of the best. That's why Hester goes in. He has so many NFL records, and I know people around my age group are going to be 100% agreeing with me with Hester. I know other people might not be. They might say, well, no, I think that Torry Holt or Reggie Wayne should get in before him, or Richard Seymour, and I respect your opinions, but I want the best of the best at their position in the Hall of Fame. That's my argument for Devin Hester. Now, I do have two more guys here, and I'm going to start with DeMarcus Ware. So, DeMarcus Ware, a complete amazing player. He was so good for so long in the NFL. He constantly terrorized the NFC East. He did win his Super Bowl once he got to Denver. He was a great player in Denver as well. So he is worth noting. I think he definitely should be in the Hall of Fame. I mean, he was just amazing as a player. I absolutely loved watching him play. I hated it, but I loved watching him play at the same time, if you know what I mean. So he belongs on the Hall of Fame. And to me, while he's essentially a linebacker, I'm more considering him a D lineman as well, which is why I didn't put Seymour or Allen in. But yeah, lastly, my last member of the Hall of Fame, Zach Thomas. Miami Dolphins, Zach Thomas finally gets on the Hall of Fame. To me, him and Brian Dawkins both got snubbed at the same time, and then Dawkins eventually made it a couple years back, but he was still snubbed for too long in my viewpoint. Zach Thomas has been snubbed for even longer, and it's disgusting to me. I'm just so fed up with this. I don't know why they're holding off on Zach Thomas. It can't be because he didn't win a Super Bowl ring, because if that's why you don't have him in the Hall of Fame, that's the dumbest excuse I've ever heard. Honestly. So, if you're wondering, who would my, 6, 7, 8 be? So, I did kind of mention it. I would have to say, I probably eliminated these guys in the wrong order. I would say Richard Seymour probably has the highest chance of the guys I didn't put in of making it, so I'd say he's 6. He's a very good player. Absolute amazing player. Was a bit of a game changer when he was at his prime in New England, and he was still very good in Oakland. Ronde Barber, I think, has a good chance, but I mean, the problem with Barber is just he doesn't get the love that he should get because he just wasn't as he brought the personality, but he wasn't as good as some may have wanted him to be for as long as he could have been. And then I'd say Torry Holt is going to be the 8th. He, as great as he was, he just wasn't there for long enough. I mean, he's been held back, and Andre Johnson gets the edge over him. The Hall is very skeptical about putting in skill positions at the same year. So 2 receivers in a class of 5 just doesn't seem like it's going to happen. Patrick Willis, my easy 9th pick. He'll make it eventually. I think everyone above Willis will make the Hall of Fame in the near future. Now, the other 6, sorry, there's chances for them, but I mean, I don't necessarily know. Reggie Wayne will make it at some point. I can all but guarantee that. But other than him, I mean, it does get a little weirder. But like Bryant, I don't know if he'll ever make it. Mills, I don't know if he'll ever make it. So, I do want to point out though, now that my class of 2022 here is essentially complete, and I went with Andre Johnson, Tony Boselli, Devin Hester, DeMarcus Ware, and Zach Thomas. I do want to say the class of 2027 is going to have some very intriguing first ballot names. We already know Tom Brady is retired. We already know Ben Roethlisberger is retired. So will the Hall put a pair of first ballot quarterbacks in the Hall of Fame? That's the intriguing part. And of course, we're probably going to see Phillip Rivers' name still on the ballot that year, because he's going to get pushed down with ease by Drew Brees, who will be a first ballot Hall of Famer in 2026. So that's where it's going to get fun. You're going to have 3 big name quarterbacks, and obviously Big Ben and Brady both slaughter. Rivers, no chance. Eli Manning could very well still be on the ballot at this time. So we're just going to have an intriguing 2 quarterbacks there. Of course, the big 2, Brady and Roethlisberger. To me, they're both first ballot Hall of Famers. I would have told you that from the very beginning. I knew Big Ben was a first ballot Hall of Famer when he announced his retirement, and then Brady went and did it the same year. Obviously, it's not like Brady said, I'm going to undermine Ben Roethlisberger. No, but, I mean, I think the NFL should do what they did with what the NHL did with Wayne Gretzky and just kind of say, Tom, you sure you want to retire? Are you 100% sure you're done? Yes. All right, we're going to retire. We're just going to induct you in the Hall of Fame today. We're going to put you in with this class today. Sound good? Cool. Shake his hand. Retire his number universally if you really want to do that. I mean, some teams wouldn't like that, but, I mean, do that. Call him the greatest, whatever you want to do. But still, other players that you're going to have potentially there, Rob Gronkowski and Adrian Peterson. So, I mean, and that's just what we know. I mean, we could see other guys like Andrew Whitworth. If the Rams win the Super Bowl, he's probably going to retire. I mean, he was expected to retire a couple years back. He could be a first ballot Hall of Famer at offensive tackle. I don't think he would be I don't think he will be if all these other guys retire. I mean, Gronk and Peterson haven't officially retired yet. Peterson's going to have off-field character concerns coming out at him, but he was too good of a player to not make the Hall of Fame, in my viewpoint. Gronkowski, he'll make the Hall of Fame first ballot if he retires. He did mention a couple weeks ago, a couple days ago, whatever it was, that he's not going to retire just because Brady does or Brady doesn't. But, I mean, I can't really see him going back to play with Kyle Trask or whoever the Buccaneers put out there. We also could see Antonio Brown on the ballot in 2027. That would be an intriguing name. I mean, you're going to always have people who are going to argue Antonio Brown belongs on the Hall of Fame. I am not one of those guys. I'm a big fan of the Big Ben effect. I would say Big Ben did it. You could also see Le'Veon Bell, but Bell's not going to make the Hall of Fame. So, I mean, there's just so many intriguing names for 2027. Here I am speculating on the future. I'm just so excited right now. We are only 8 days away from learning who will be in the class of 2022. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. It went on a little longer than I was expecting it to, but at the same time, I mean, I wanted to get to each player individually, discuss their case, their pros and their cons. I wanted to, of course, discuss why I eliminated a certain player, when I eliminated him, and yeah. But again, I hope you guys enjoyed this. We had 2 interesting sims. We had a sim for the Super Bowl with a very interesting glitch at one point, and then I just completely randomly did the Saints and the Ravens without even realizing that it was essentially a battle of 2 of the most mobile quarterbacks in the league. Arguably the 2 best running quarterbacks in the league. I mean, you could always make a case for Josh Allen, but either way, hope you guys enjoyed this video. These were my 2022 Hall of Fame predictions for the NFL class. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any comments, please feel free to leave them below. I will respond to you. Have a great rest of your day and stay safe.